I ate up for telling my sister and her family that they have to stay somewhere else even though they lost everything? When my sister and her family arrived on my doorstep 3 weeks ago, it was like a whirlwind of emotions crashed into my house. I knew they had lost everything. The footage of the storm that swept through their town in North Carolina had been all over the news. A destructive force that tore through homes and upended lives in just a matter of hours. My sister and her family were lucky to be alive. They had been far away, in Illinois, attending my wedding when it all happened. So, when they came back to find their house and everything in it gone, they had nowhere to go. The call from my sister had come in late that night. I was still basking in the afterglow of the wedding, surrounded by well wishes and thank you notes, not yet settled back into the routine of regular life. When I heard her voice, thick with shock and sorrow, it was like the world shifted. She didn't even need to ask before I offered for them to stay with us. What else could I have done? She's my little sister. There was no way I would have let them stay in a motel or on someone else's couch when I had space for them here. And so, just days after what was supposed to be one of the happiest weekends of my life, they arrived, my sister, her husband, and their 3 kids, 5, 3, and 1 year old, squeezed into my living room with hastily packed bags and wide, tired eyes. They had nothing left. Even their clothes had been donated by people in town. The only possessions they had reduced to what was in those bags. I'd never seen my sister look so worn down, so lost. I tried my best to be upbeat and welcoming, masking my worry behind big smiles and cheerful words. But there was no hiding the weight of their loss. The way it hung over everything like a dark cloud. In those first few days, I told myself it would be okay. We'd adjust. It was temporary, just until they figured out the next steps. My husband was supportive, and our kids were thrilled to have their cousins around. My 6-year-old loved the chaos of a full house. And even my toddler seemed more entertained, running around with the older kids, laughing and screaming. It felt like we were all pitching in, rallying around my sister's family to help them get through this impossible time. But as the days wore on, the reality of our situation began to settle in. Hosting 3 extra kids was hard enough. But when they were as young as my sisters, it was exhausting. I'm used to a certain level of chaos, of course. My 2-year-old is a hurricane of energy, and my 6-year-old has a wild streak. But I've always been able to keep things relatively under control. I've made my home as toddler-proof as possible, everything locked, covered, or out of reach, because I know firsthand what a curious little mind can do in just a few unsupervised seconds. My sister, however, doesn't share my cautious approach. It became clear almost immediately that she didn't understand why I had so many locks and safety measures in place. I have locks on cabinets, door handles, even the refrigerator and oven. It's not just about convenience, it's about safety. If my toddler can get into something, he will, and the last thing I want is for him to get hurt. But from the moment she arrived, my sister started grumbling about the overkill of it all. "Do you really need this many locks?" she'd say, a frustrated sigh escaping her whenever she struggled to open a cabinet or get a snack for one of her kids. I'd smile tightly and explain, again and again, that yes, I do. My son's a handful, more so than her 3 ever were at that age. From what I can tell, he's the type of kid who will turn his back on you for 1 second and have a cleaning product in his hands the next. I'm constantly on edge, constantly aware of what he's doing and where he's going. The locks give me some peace of mind. But instead of trying to respect that, my sister began systematically undoing everything. Little by little, day by day, I noticed the locks left open or entirely undone. At first, I thought it was just an oversight. She's been through so much, after all. But when I found the cleaning supplies cabinet wide open one morning and my son toddling over to investigate, I realized it wasn't an accident. She was intentionally leaving things unlocked because she found it too much of a hassle. I tried to talk to her gently at first, explaining that I understood things were different here and that the setup probably felt over the top, but that it was necessary for my son's safety. I can't relax if I don't know things are locked up, I said. I need to know he's safe. She nodded, looking apologetic for a moment, but then shrugged. I just don't think it's a big deal. You're making things harder on yourself with all these barriers. It was a small comment, said offhandedly, but it stuck with me. I was trying to make things easier for her. For all of us. And she couldn't even take a few extra seconds to relock a cabinet? I brushed it off, reminding myself that she was under immense stress. That she was dealing with unimaginable loss. But the frustration simmered under the surface. I couldn't help feeling like she was disregarding my rules. My safety concerns. In my own home. The kids added to the stress, of course. Having 5 young children running around a house not designed to accommodate them was a challenge on a good day. My 6-year-old was doing his best to share his toys and his space. But I could see his patience wearing thin. My toddler, who is already in the habit of getting into things, seemed to take the constant unlocking as a green light to explore every corner of the house. And with my sister's youngest still learning to walk, it felt like I was constantly one step away from a disaster. But what really started to wear me down was my sister's attitude. I understood that she was grieving. I understood that she felt displaced, uncomfortable, overwhelmed, but each time I asked her to be more mindful of the locks, her response was the same, a roll of the eyes, a dismissive sigh, and a muttered comment about how hard it is to deal with all this. She acted like I was the unreasonable one. Like I was imposing some ridiculous rules just to make her life more difficult. It didn't matter how many times I reminded her why they were there. She just didn't care. I tried to stay calm, to be patient and understanding. But every time I found a door handle unlocked or a cabinet left open, the frustration built a little more. It wasn't just the inconvenience of having to redo the locks. It was the fact that she was putting my child at risk. She was in my home, staying here because I'd opened my doors to her when she had nowhere else to go. And she couldn't be bothered to follow a simple rule to keep my son safe? I knew it was building towards something. Some kind of breaking point. I could feel it looming. A confrontation waiting to happen. But each day, I swallowed my irritation, telling myself that it wasn't the time. That she needed support, not more stress. I reminded myself over and over that she'd lost everything. That she was dealing with a trauma I couldn't fully understand. But even with all that compassion and empathy, a small voice in the back of my mind kept whispering the same question. What about my family? What about my home? The tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I knew something had to change. But I didn't know how to ask without sounding heartless. How could I tell my own sister, who had lost her entire world, that she was pushing me to my limits and the one place I was supposed to feel in control? So, I did what I'd been doing since she arrived. I kept quiet, pushing down my feelings, hoping that somehow, some way, things would get easier. But deep down, I knew I was only fooling myself. Something had to give, and soon. It didn't take long for things to start unraveling. What began as a minor annoyance, the constant unlocking of everything, quickly spiraled into a source of daily frustration. I found myself walking through the house like a detective. Checking locks, re-locking cabinets, double-checking that dangerous items were out of reach. Every time I came across something left wide open, a new wave of irritation surged through me. The locks weren't just for convenience, they were for safety. My 2-year-old was curious. And any lapse in supervision could lead to a disaster. The worst part was that it seemed like my sister didn't even care. It wasn't just that she wasn't used to my system, it was that she refused to respect it. I'd walk into the kitchen and find the pantry door wide open. Her 5-year-old rummaging through the shelves while my toddler wandered dangerously close to the trash can, trying to tip it over. The sight of it made my heart race. It only took 1 second of inattention for something to go wrong. And I couldn't afford that kind of risk. I'd quietly remind her, again, to lock things up. Every time, she'd give me that same exasperated look. As though I were overreacting. They're just kids, she'd say, as if that explained everything. They're going to get into stuff no matter what you do. Yes, they were kids, but that was exactly why I needed the locks. They got into things because they didn't know any better. And I couldn't spend every second of every day standing over them, watching their every move. I needed the peace of mind that came with knowing my home was secure. That my son couldn't wander into a cabinet full of cleaning supplies or stick his hand in the oven. But the more I tried to explain, the more she dug in her heels. It was as if she saw my rules as some kind of personal affront. An inconvenience she wasn't willing to deal with. "Why do you have to make everything so hard?" she'd ask. Her voice tinged with irritation. "My kids never needed all these locks. You're making yourself crazy." I knew her situation was unimaginable. She had lost everything, her home, her possessions, her sense of stability. But no matter how much I tried to be understanding, it didn't change the fact that she was dismissing my concerns in my own house. The resentment started creeping in slowly, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I wanted to help her, to make things easier for her. But how could I do that when she refused to follow the most basic rules? It wasn't just the locks, either. With 5 young kids running around, my house was constantly in chaos. Toys were scattered across the floor, dishes piled up in the sink, and sticky fingerprints appeared on every surface. My kids had their own routines and rhythms. And having 3 more children in the house completely upended that. My 6-year-old, who was used to having his own space, was suddenly sharing everything: his toys, his room, his time, with his cousins. I could see the strain on his face. The way he hesitated before inviting them to play. Like he was worried they'd take over. And my 2-year-old? He was getting into everything even more now. With the older kids leaving doors open and toys everywhere, I'd catch him in the bathroom trying to climb into the tub. Or sneaking toward the stairs that were supposed to be blocked off. It felt like I was constantly chasing him, pulling him out of trouble before something terrible happened. Every time I found him somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, my heart would race, imagining the worst. I tried talking to my sister about it, calmly at first. I sat her down one evening after the kids were asleep and told her how stressed I was. How overwhelmed I felt trying to keep everyone safe and the house in order. I thought maybe if I explained how important the locks were to me, she'd finally understand. But instead, she just rolled her eyes and sighed. "You're making things harder than they need to be," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I'm sorry you're stressed. But it's not that big of a deal." Not that big of a deal? It wasn't her child who was getting into the cleaning supplies. It wasn't her house that was constantly one step away from chaos. I bit my tongue, trying to stay calm, but I could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface. The next day, I came home from running a quick errand to find my toddler in the kitchen, holding a jar of peanut butter in one hand and a butter knife in the other. My heart nearly stopped. I rushed over, grabbing the knife from his tiny fingers and locking the pantry door behind me. My sister stood there, completely unfazed, as if nothing dangerous had happened. "That's why the locks are there," I said, my voice rising in frustration. "This is exactly what I've been trying to tell you." She shrugged, not even bothering to look up from her phone. "He's fine. You worry too much." I couldn't believe her. How could she be so indifferent to something so serious? I knew she was going through a hard time, but that didn't give her the right to ignore the rules that were in place to keep my kids safe. I felt like I was on the verge of snapping, but I swallowed my anger again, telling myself that she was still processing her loss and that maybe, eventually, she'd start to take things more seriously. But things only got worse. The tension between us grew stronger each day. The little arguments about locks and messes turning into larger, unspoken frustrations. I'd find her kids playing in the living room, toys strewn everywhere, while my 6-year-old sat in the corner, quietly building Lego towers by himself. He wasn't used to sharing his space, and I could see how much it was bothering him. But I didn't know how to fix it without making my sister feel like an unwelcome guest. I tried to keep the peace, but it felt like I was fighting a losing battle. Every time I mentioned the locks, or asked her to help clean up, or tried to set boundaries, she'd push back with a sigh or a sarcastic comment. She was defensive, her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. And I couldn't tell if she was angry at me or if her anger was really directed at everything she had lost. It wasn't like I didn't understand. I knew that she was overwhelmed, that she was still grieving the loss of her home and her normal life. But it didn't make it any easier to live with her. The constant mess, the noise, the disregard for the rules I'd put in place for my own children, it all built up. Day after day, until I felt like I was drowning in it. And the worst part was, I couldn't talk to her about it without feeling like I was the one who was being selfish. Every time I brought up how overwhelmed I was, she'd remind me of what she had lost. As if that excused everything else. It was a cycle I couldn't break. I'd get frustrated. She'd deflect with guilt. And I'd end up feeling like the bad guy for even complaining. I was stuck in my own house, torn between wanting to help my sister and needing to protect my own family's peace of mind. But deep down, I knew this wasn't sustainable. Something had to change. I just didn't know how to get there without tearing our relationship apart in the process. As the days passed, I found myself trapped in a relentless cycle of guilt and frustration. On the one hand, my sister had lost everything, her home, her belongings, her sense of security, and it seemed like I should have endless patience and understanding for what she was going through. But on the other hand, this was my house, my home, the place where I was supposed to feel safe and in control. Where my children's safety came first. It was becoming impossible to ignore how much she was disregarding my rules and pushing me toward a breaking point. Every time I walked into the kitchen and found a cabinet unlocked, or my 2-year-old playing with something dangerous, the knot of tension in my chest tightened. I kept telling myself that I needed to be more understanding, that I had to cut her some slack. But I was growing more and more exhausted. It wasn't just physical exhaustion from running after 5 kids all day. It was the emotional toll of constantly feeling disrespected in my own home, of having my boundaries ignored. The guilt was overwhelming, though. Every time I considered confronting her more forcefully, I'd remember the look on her face the night she arrived at my house. She'd been hollowed out by the loss of her home, by the sheer weight of what had happened. How could I add to that by making her feel unwelcome or demanding that she leave? Wasn't I supposed to be her safe space right now? Family supports family, I kept telling myself, but each day felt like my resolve was being chipped away. Still, the resentment grew. I couldn't stop myself from thinking, why isn't she even trying? It wasn't as though I was asking her to do something unreasonable. Locking cabinets and securing dangerous items were basic safety measures. And yet, she acted like it was some Herculean task. My sister had always been more laid back than me. More, go with the flow. But this was different. This was outright neglecting what I had clearly explained was necessary to keep my toddler safe. I started noticing the way her own kids had free reign over the house. They left toys scattered everywhere, opened cupboards and drawers, pulled things off countertops. My house, which had once been organized, well, as organized as a home with 2 kids could be, now looked like a war zone most days. I couldn't walk across the living room without tripping over something. The mess wasn't just physical, it was mental too. It felt like I couldn't keep my thoughts straight when every corner of my home was cluttered and chaotic. I had tried to be patient. I had told myself that this was temporary, that things would get better once my sister had time to process her loss and figure out her next steps. But how long was I supposed to wait? How long was I supposed to carry the burden of not only keeping my own family safe but trying to keep hers safe too? It wasn't fair. My sister wasn't doing her part. She wasn't helping. Not with the kids. Not with the house. Not with anything. One evening, I sat down at the kitchen table after getting the kids to bed. My own kids had finally settled down after a long day of tantrums and overstimulation, and I felt completely drained. The house was a disaster, and I didn't have the energy to clean it. I stared at the mess. The dirty dishes piled in the sink, the crumbs covering the floor, and I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. I heard my sister laughing softly in the living room with her husband. They were watching TV, completely oblivious to the fact that I had spent the entire evening running after the kids while trying to maintain some semblance of order. They hadn't helped clean up after dinner. They hadn't even asked if I needed help getting the kids ready for bed. They were guests in my home, but they were acting like they had no responsibility to contribute, no obligation to respect the rules of the house. My resentment flared into anger. I was doing everything, keeping the house safe, managing the kids, trying to make everyone comfortable, and my sister couldn't even be bothered to lock a cabinet after she opened it. The guilt I had been holding onto. The voice in my head telling me I needed to be more understanding. was drowned out by the frustration that had been building for weeks. I started to wonder if my sister even appreciated what I was doing for her. Did she understand the sacrifices I was making? Or did she just see it as something I owed her because we were family? Every time I reminded her about the locks or asked her to clean up after her kids, she seemed to brush it off like I was overreacting. Like I was the one making things difficult. But I wasn't the one who had left my child at risk. I wasn't the one who had made the house a danger zone. And yet, even with all that anger simmering beneath the surface, I couldn't bring myself to say anything. I kept thinking about how much she had lost. About how displaced and broken she must have felt. How could I pile more on top of that? How could I tell her that she was making my life harder? That her presence was overwhelming. That I was starting to feel like I couldn't breathe in my own home? But as the days passed, it became harder and harder to push those feelings down. The breaking point was coming. And I could feel it. Every little argument, every unlocked cabinet, every mess left behind, it all added up, building towards something I knew I wouldn't be able to hold back for much longer. One afternoon, after finding my toddler in the bathroom playing with shampoo bottles my sister had left out, I felt something snap inside me. I was tired of cleaning up after everyone. Tired of having to constantly watch my kids to make sure they weren't getting into dangerous situations that could have been easily avoided. I was tired of feeling like a bad person for wanting some basic respect for my home and my rules. The guilt was still there, lingering in the background, but it no longer outweighed the frustration. I knew I needed to say something. I couldn't keep living like this. Not when my own family's safety and well-being were at stake. But how could I confront her without making things worse? How could I tell her that her presence was becoming a burden without sounding heartless? I didn't have the answer. But I knew one thing for sure. Something had to change. And soon. The day it all came to a head was a day like any other, or at least it started that way. I woke up to the usual chaos, my 2-year-old crying for breakfast, my 6-year-old asking if he could watch cartoons, and the sound of my sister's kids already running through the house like a stampede. My sister was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone with a cup of coffee in hand, looking as if she didn't have a care in the world. Meanwhile, I was mentally running through my to-do list, already feeling the weight of the day ahead pressing down on me. I tried not to let my irritation show. I went through the motions, making breakfast, cleaning up spills, and trying to maintain some semblance of order. But every time I saw an unlocked cabinet or a door left ajar, the tension in my chest tightened a little more. My sister's 3 kids were just as wild as ever, tearing through the living room, leaving toys and food wrappers in their wake. My own kids, usually pretty well behaved, seemed to be feeding off the chaos. My 6-year-old was unusually short-tempered, and my 2-year-old was restless, getting into things even more than usual. By mid-morning, I was already exhausted. My sister had disappeared into the guest room, leaving me to wrangle all 5 kids. I tried to tell myself that it was fine, that I could handle it. But the truth was, I was barely holding on. The guilt was still there, whispering that I shouldn't be so resentful, that I should be more understanding of her situation. But the frustration was louder now, rising in waves that were harder and harder to push down. Things escalated in the early afternoon. I was in the kitchen, trying to clean up after lunch, when I heard a loud crash from the living room. My heart leapt into my throat. I rushed out to find my 2-year-old standing in front of the cleaning closet, a broom lying on the floor at his feet. The cleaning closet, the one I always kept locked because it was full of dangerous cleaning supplies. He was fine, thank God. He was fine, but the realization of what could have happened sent a shock of panic through me. I hurried over, scooping him up in my arms, my heart racing. He had only grabbed the broom. But what if it had been something else? What if he had gotten into the bleach or the disinfectant? The thought made me feel sick. I turned around and saw my sister standing in the doorway, watching with a neutral expression. Not even alarmed. You left the cleaning closet unlocked, I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. She sighed, as if I were accusing her of something minor. It's just a broom. He's fine. Just a broom. That was all she had to say. That was it. The final straw. I had been patient. I had tried to keep the peace. But this was too much. This is exactly why I keep telling you to lock things. I shouted, my voice louder than I intended. It's dangerous, and I'm sick of repeating myself. She folded her arms across her chest, a defensive look flashing across her face. I don't know why you're so obsessed with all these locks. You're acting like I'm putting your kids in danger on purpose. Because you are. The words came out before I could stop them. You are putting them in danger. You don't respect my rules. You don't care about the safety of my kids in my own home. And I've had enough. Her eyes widened in surprise. And for a moment, she was silent, but then, just as quickly, her expression shifted to one of indignation. I've lost everything, and you're yelling at me about locks? I can't believe you're making such a big deal out of this. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I couldn't believe she was turning this around on me again. My hands shook with anger. And I could feel the words bubbling up. Words I hadn't planned on saying. But ones that were desperate to be heard. It's not my fault you lost everything. You can't keep using that as an excuse to ignore the rules in my house. I get that this is hard for you. But that doesn't mean you get to disregard everything I've asked you to do. Her face flushed with anger now. Her voice rising to meet mine. How can you say that? You think I want to be here? I have nowhere else to go. You're the one who said I could stay. And now you're acting like I'm some burden. Do you have any idea what I've been through? I know what you've been through. I shot back, my frustration boiling over. But this is my home. And you're putting my kids at risk because you don't want to deal with a few extra locks. I've been trying to be patient. But I can't do this anymore. I can't live like this. Constantly worrying about whether or not my house is safe because you won't follow the rules. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between us. My chest heaved with the force of my emotions. And I could see the shock in her eyes as the weight of my words settled in. I felt a brief pang of regret, wondering if I had gone too far. If I had said something I couldn't take back. But before I could say anything else, she spoke again, her voice colder now, her defenses fully up. Fine. You want me to leave? I'll leave. I didn't ask to be here in the first place. I'll figure something out. Her words stung. But I didn't stop her. I couldn't. I had reached my breaking point. And even though part of me felt terrible for what I had said, another part of me, the part that had been holding onto this frustration for weeks, felt like I couldn't go back. She turned and walked out of the room without another word. And I stood there, my heart pounding, feeling the weight of what had just happened. I wanted to cry, to scream, to apologize. But at the same time, I felt a strange sense of relief. The confrontation I had been avoiding for so long had finally happened. And as painful as it was, I knew it couldn't have gone on any longer. Something had to give. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. My sister stayed in the guest room with her kids. And I stayed with mine. Barely able to look at each other when we crossed paths. I knew she was angry. I was angry, too. But underneath that anger was something deeper, a sadness. A sense of loss. Not just for her home but for the bond we used to have. I had wanted to help her. To be the support system she needed. But now it felt like everything had gone wrong. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat in the quiet of my living room, staring at the mess that still needed to be cleaned. I felt exhausted, physically and emotionally, and I couldn't stop replaying the argument in my head. I hated the way I had lost control. The way I had let my frustration explode. But at the same time, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, walking on eggshells, trying to balance my sister's needs with my own. I had my own family to protect. And that had to come first. She was still here, for now, but I knew that things couldn't stay this way. The damage had been done. And I wasn't sure how, or if, we could fix it. After the argument, the house felt suffocatingly quiet. But the air was thick with unspoken tension. My sister stayed holed up in the guest room with her kids for most of the day. And I stayed in my own bubble, trying to distract myself with mundane tasks, folding laundry, scrubbing the countertops, organizing the fridge. Every chore I completed felt like an attempt to clean up not just the mess in the house, but the mess I had just made between us. But no matter how spotless I made the kitchen, I couldn't shake the heavy feeling that lingered inside me. I kept thinking about the look on her face when I told her she had to leave. The shock, the hurt, the disbelief. It had all been there in her eyes. And now I felt like the worst person in the world. I didn't want to be cruel. I wasn't trying to kick her out when she was at her lowest. But I had hit my limit. The constant unlocking of cabinets. The mess. The casual disregard for the safety of my kids. Something had to give. But now, with the adrenaline of the argument gone, all I was left with was guilt. I tried to focus on the kids, hoping they wouldn't sense the tension between my sister and me. But children are more perceptive than we give them credit for. My 6-year-old seemed quieter than usual, picking up on the strained silence in the house. Even my 2-year-old, normally full of energy and mischief, seemed more subdued. They could feel that something wasn't right. And I hated that I had let things get to this point. This was supposed to be a safe, welcoming home, and now it felt like a battleground. In the days that followed, we barely spoke to each other. Every time we crossed paths in the kitchen or the hallway, it was like walking on eggshells. I couldn't bring myself to apologize. Though I wanted to, I told myself that I had nothing to apologize for, that I had been right to stand up for my boundaries. That it was her responsibility to respect the rules of my house. But the guilt gnawed at me constantly. She had lost her home. She was homeless, with 3 young children, and here I was, making her feel even worse. What kind of sister was I? She didn't say much either. The only words exchanged between us were about the kids. And even then, it was just logistical. Can you watch them for a few minutes while I take a shower? Or, the baby's bottle is on the counter. There was no warmth, no conversation beyond what was absolutely necessary. The tension was palpable, and I could feel the distance growing between us, stretching wider with every passing day. But even with the silence, the frustration lingered. She still left things unlocked, still let her kids run wild in the house, still acted as though my concerns were overblown. I tried not to focus on it. But every time I saw my 2-year-old inching toward an open cabinet or found another mess left behind, I felt my irritation bubble up again. I didn't want to start another argument, so I bit my tongue and tried to deal with it quietly. But it was exhausting. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the mess scattered across the floor: Legos, dolls, half-eaten snacks, and blankets strewn about like the aftermath of a hurricane. My 6-year-old sat in the corner, quietly playing with a toy, clearly trying to keep to himself. He had been doing that more and more lately, retreating into his own space, avoiding the chaos of the house. I knelt down beside him and asked if he was okay. And he just nodded, not saying much. It hit me then how much this situation was affecting him, too. He had been so good about sharing his space, his toys, his home with his cousins. But it was wearing on him. I could see it in the way he seemed more tired, more withdrawn. He was used to having order, structure, a sense of calm in our home. And now everything felt upside down. I had been so focused on how overwhelmed I felt that I hadn't stopped to think about how much this was impacting him. I looked around the room. The chaos, the noise, the lack of peace. And I felt that familiar surge of frustration. This was my house, my family. I had tried so hard to accommodate my sister, to help her through this terrible time. But now it felt like I was sacrificing too much. I didn't want to resent her, but it was getting harder not to. That evening, I sat in bed after getting the kids to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts. I kept replaying the argument, hearing her words echo in my head. I didn't ask to be here. I have nowhere else to go. She was right. She hadn't asked for any of this. Hadn't asked for her life to be upended, her home destroyed, and she hadn't asked to be stuck in a house with me either, where every day felt like walking a tightrope between guilt and frustration. I tried to imagine what she must be feeling, how disoriented she must be, living in someone else's home with no sense of when or how her life would return to normal. She had lost everything, and here I was, complaining about unlocked cabinets and messes on the floor. I felt petty, selfish even, for being so fixated on my own frustration when she was going through something so much worse. But then I reminded myself that my feelings were valid, too. I wasn't just her sister, I was a mom. And my first responsibility was to my kids. My home was supposed to be a safe space for them. A place where they could feel secure and protected. And right now, it didn't feel like that. It felt chaotic and unsafe. And I had every right to be upset about that. I kept going back and forth, caught in this mental tug-of-war between guilt and the need for boundaries. I wanted to help her, but I also needed to protect my own peace of mind, my own family. It felt like an impossible balance to strike. A few days later, my sister broke the silence. She came into the kitchen where I was cleaning up after breakfast. And for the first time in days, she looked me in the eye. "I've been looking for somewhere else to stay," she said quietly. "I don't want to keep causing problems here." Her words caught me off guard. I hadn't expected her to bring it up. And for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to say that she didn't need to go, that we could figure it out. But I couldn't bring myself to lie. The truth was, I was relieved. The tension between us had become unbearable. And I didn't know how much longer we could keep this up without completely ruining our relationship. "I think that's a good idea," I said, my voice soft but steady. "I want to help you. But I also need things to be safe for my kids. I'm sorry for how things have been. I didn't want it to get to this point." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry too," she said. "I know it's been hard on you. I didn't mean to make things worse." We stood there for a few moments, the weight of everything hanging between us. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was something. It was acknowledgement, a small step toward understanding. And that was more than we had managed in days. The conversation was brief, but it felt like a turning point. We still hadn't resolved everything, but the silence between us had been broken. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like there might be a way forward, just not with her living in my house. The morning after our brief conversation, I woke up feeling a strange sense of relief. There was still tension in the air, but it was lighter now, as if the unspoken weight we had been carrying for weeks had finally been lifted. Knowing that my sister was looking for somewhere else to stay made the house feel a little less suffocating. Even if the situation wasn't resolved yet, we had reached a point where neither of us was ready to confront the deeper issues head-on. But at least we'd acknowledged the need for change. It was a step in the right direction. And that was enough for now. That day, my sister and I actually talked, not just in passing. Not just about the kids. But a real conversation. It wasn't deep. It wasn't about the argument. But it was the first time in weeks that it felt like we could interact without the underlying bitterness bubbling up. We talked about little things. The kids' favorite toys. The weather. What to make for dinner. It wasn't much. But it was something. It felt like the walls we had built between us were starting to come down. Even if only slightly. As we sat at the kitchen table that afternoon, the kids running around in the backyard, she finally broke the surface tension. "I'm sorry," she said, not quite looking me in the eye. "I know I haven't been making things easy. I've been overwhelmed with everything." I didn't know what to say at first. The apology felt tentative, fragile, but it was an olive branch. And I knew I needed to take it. "I get it," I said, trying to keep my tone gentle. "This whole situation is awful. I can't even imagine how hard it's been for you. But you have to understand. This is hard for me too. I'm not trying to make things more difficult. But I have to think about my kids' safety. The locks, the rules, they're not about making things harder for you. They're about keeping my kids safe." She nodded, finally meeting my eyes. "I know. I didn't mean to ignore that. I'm still trying to figure everything out. I've lost so much. And it's been hard to think straight." For the first time since she arrived, I saw the exhaustion on her face. The weight of what she'd been carrying. She was hurting in a way I hadn't fully appreciated. I had been so focused on my frustration and my own sense of being overwhelmed that I hadn't given enough space for her grief. Yes, she had been careless. And yes, her behavior had driven me to the edge, but underneath it all, she was just trying to survive. "I know you didn't mean to," I said softly. I think we both need to remember that we're in this together. I want to help you. I do. But we have to find a way that works for everyone. I need things to be safe and manageable here. But I get that this is impossible for you, too." There was a pause. The tension between us still present, but softer now. She sighed deeply, rubbing her hands together. I'll try harder. I know I've been difficult. It's just, I feel like I don't have control over anything anymore. Even with the kids. With where we are. It's like I'm floating around, waiting for something to fall back into place. But nothing's falling into place. Her voice cracked. And in that moment, I saw just how much she was struggling. It wasn't just about the locks or the mess. It was about the uncertainty of her entire life. Everything had been ripped away from her. And she didn't know how to put it back together. Suddenly, I felt a wave of sympathy wash over me. Yes, she had been frustrating. But I had to acknowledge how lost she must have felt. I'm sorry too, I said quietly. I haven't been as patient as I should have been. I can't imagine what it's like to be going through this. For the first time in weeks, there was a real sense of understanding between us. It wasn't a perfect moment, it wasn't as though everything was suddenly fixed, but it felt like the air had cleared. The apologies weren't just words, they were an acknowledgement of the pain we were both feeling. The different kinds of loss we were both carrying. Hers was raw and immediate. A life shattered by disaster. Mine was quieter but no less real. The slow erosion of the peace and control I had worked so hard to build in my home. After that, things got better, if only a little. My sister made more of an effort to follow the rules of the house. The locks stayed in place. The cabinets remained secure. And I didn't feel like I was constantly chasing after my toddler to keep him safe. She even started helping more around the house. Picking up after her kids and cleaning up the kitchen after meals. It wasn't perfect, but it was an improvement. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But I knew this was only a temporary solution. The undercurrent of tension still remained. Just beneath the surface, no matter how much we apologized or tried to patch things up. The reality was that having 5 kids in one house, with 2 overwhelmed mothers trying to navigate their own lives, wasn't sustainable. We were both walking on a tightrope. And it was only a matter of time before something tipped us off balance again. A few days after our conversation, my sister came to me with a plan. She had talked to an old friend from college who lived a few hours away. Someone who had offered her and the kids a place to stay until they figured out their next steps. It wasn't ideal, she would be farther away from me, from the support I could offer, but it was an option. And it was clear that we both needed some space. I think we'll go next week, she said, her voice calm but resigned. It's not permanent, but at least it'll give us some breathing room. I know things have been tough here. I nodded, trying to keep my emotions in check. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness at the thought of her leaving. On one hand, I needed the house to return to some semblance of normalcy. I needed space, quiet, safety, and a break from the constant tension. But on the other hand, I knew she was still hurting. And part of me felt like I was abandoning her in a time when she needed me most. I think that's a good idea, I said softly, but just know that I'm still here for you. Whenever you need anything, or if you want to come back, I'm always here. She gave me a small, grateful smile, and for a brief moment, the tension between us faded. It felt like we had come to a quiet understanding. We couldn't fix everything, but we could at least try to meet each other halfway. In the following days, we returned to a fragile sense of normalcy. The kids still made messes. The house was still chaotic. But there was less of the silent resentment that had hung between us before. My sister packed up her things. And though we didn't talk about it much, we both knew that the move was the right decision. As the day of her departure approached, I felt a pang of sadness, mixed with relief. I wasn't sure what the future would hold for her, or for our relationship, but at least for now, we had found a way to move forward, however temporary that resolution might be. The morning my sister left, the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet, considering the level of chaos that had become normal in the past few weeks. Her kids had been up early, excited about the trip to their new temporary home. And my own kids had caught the energy. There was noise, of course, shuffling of bags. The hum of the car engine as they packed everything into the backseat. But under all that was a sense of finality. Of something coming to an end. I stood by the door as my sister helped her kids into the car. It was strange, watching them leave, I'd been waiting for this moment. For the house to feel calm again. For the tension to lift. But now that it was here, all I could feel was the weight of the silence pressing down on me. My 6-year-old clung to my leg, watching his cousins pile into the car. His face a mixture of relief and sadness. He hadn't said much about them leaving, but I could tell he felt conflicted too. The whirlwind of activity, the sharing of his toys, his space, it had been overwhelming for him. But they were still family. I watched my sister make one last trip back to the house to grab a bag she'd left inside. She moved slower than usual, like the weight of the situation was finally catching up to her. There was no argument between us. No lingering resentment. The past few days had been calm. Almost peaceful compared to the weeks before. But it was the kind of peace that comes when you know you're nearing the end of something. Not because things have truly been resolved, but because you've run out of energy to fight. We were both tired. Tired of walking on eggshells. Tired of trying to make this arrangement work when it clearly wasn't. As she came back out, she glanced at me, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The kids were buckled in, her husband in the driver's seat, ready to go, but she stood there, bag slung over her shoulder, and gave me a look that was hard to read. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't exactly sadness either. Maybe it was a mix of everything: exhaustion, guilt, regret. I didn't know what she was thinking, but I could guess it mirrored my own emotions. "I'll let you know when we get there," she said, her voice quiet, almost tentative. "And thank you for everything." I nodded, my throat tightening as I tried to find the right words. "You know you can come back if you need to," I said softly, "but I think this is the right thing. For both of us." She nodded too, her eyes tired but understanding. "Yeah, I think so too. It's just hard." The understatement of the year. It was hard. All of it. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions: anger, frustration, guilt, and everything in between. And now, standing here as she prepared to drive away, I could feel the weight of all of it pressing down on me at once. I wanted to say something comforting. Something that would ease the tension between us. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I reached out and gave her a quick hug. It was brief and awkward, but it felt necessary. She hugged me back, holding on for just a second longer than I expected. When she pulled away, her eyes were red-rimmed. Though she wasn't crying. Not yet. "Anyway, I'll be okay," she said, as if trying to reassure both of us. "We'll figure things out." I believed her. My sister was resilient. She had always found a way to land on her feet, even when life had thrown her curveballs. This was just another storm she'd have to weather, literally and figuratively. But I also knew that she wasn't as strong as she pretended to be. The past few weeks had shown me that losing everything had taken a toll on her in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until now. As she climbed into the car, I watched her glance at her kids in the backseat, her face softening. They were oblivious to the weight she was carrying. To them, this was just another adventure. Another stop on their journey to wherever home would be next. They didn't understand the complexity of it all. But I did. And so did she. The car pulled out of the driveway. And I stood there for a long moment, watching it disappear down the road. The house was still and quiet behind me. But instead of the relief I thought I'd feel, there was only an emptiness. A space where the noise and chaos had been. I felt like I should have been glad. After all, this was what I'd wanted: peace, order, a sense of control again. But now that I had it, the emptiness weighed heavily on me. When I went back inside, the house felt different. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the absence of them. My kids played quietly in the living room, their usual routine returning now that their cousins were gone. I looked around at the mess that was still scattered across the house. The toys. The crumbs. The jackets left hanging on chairs. Normally, I would have rushed to clean it all up, to restore some sense of order. But this time, I let it sit. Instead, I sat down on the couch and let myself think about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. My sister's stay had pushed me to my breaking point. And I had been angry, frustrated, even resentful. But now, with the house quiet and empty, I started to question whether I had handled things the right way. I had tried to help. But had I been compassionate enough? Should I have been more patient? More understanding? After all, she had lost everything. The guilt returned, gnawing at me. But at the same time, I knew that this was the best decision for both of us. Having her and her family here, while well-intentioned, had pushed us to a place where neither of us could function. We were constantly at odds. Our different approaches to parenting, safety, and managing chaos creating a tension that neither of us knew how to resolve. I knew my decision to ask her to leave wasn't easy, and it hadn't come from a place of cruelty. But still, it felt like a failure. A failure of family, of sisterhood, of support. I wanted to be there for her. But I also needed to protect my own space. My own peace. I just hadn't realized how hard it would be to balance those two needs. Over the next few days, the house slowly returned to normal. The mess got cleaned up. The locks stayed locked. And the noise levels dropped back to something manageable. My kids adjusted to having their space back. And I started to feel a sense of calm again. But it was a bittersweet calm. I missed my sister. Despite everything, I missed the way we used to be. Before the storm had torn through her life and brought all this chaos into mine. She texted me a few days later, letting me know they had arrived safely at her friend's place. She said the kids were adjusting. That she was starting to make plans for what came next. I could tell from the tone of her message that she was still hurting. That things between us weren't fully mended. But at least we were talking again. At least there was still a bridge between us. Even if it was fragile. I texted her back, telling her that I was here if she needed anything. And I meant it. I didn't know if or when she'd come back. But I wanted her to know that the door wasn't closed. Things had been hard, yes. But she was still my sister. And despite everything that had happened, I still loved her. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun set over the quiet street, I realized that there wasn't going to be a clean resolution to any of this. There wouldn't be a moment where I felt completely at peace with my decision or where everything went back to the way it was before. But maybe that was okay. Maybe it was enough that we had survived the storm, together. In our own messy, imperfect way. A few weeks had passed since my sister left. And the house had fully returned to the way it was before. There was quiet again. Not the eerie silence that had followed her departure. But a genuine sense of calm. The kids had settled back into their routines. My 6-year-old was himself again, enjoying the peace of having his own space. And my 2-year-old was back to his usual mischievous but manageable self. From the outside, it looked like everything was back to normal. The locks were still in place. The house was organized. And I had the order I'd been craving for what felt like forever. But something still didn't sit right with me. Every time I let my mind wander, I found myself replaying the events of the last few weeks. The argument, the guilt, the decision to ask my sister to leave, it all came rushing back in waves. Leaving me with this nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what was bothering me. I had told myself, and everyone else who asked, that I had done the right thing. My sister had been careless in my home, putting my kids at risk. And I had set boundaries to protect them. In theory, that was the truth. But the more I thought about it, the more I started to question whether my actions had been driven by the need for safety or by my own frustration. By a desperation to regain control over my space and my life. When my friends asked how things were going, I'd tell them the same story, that hosting my sister and her kids had been stressful. That she didn't respect the rules of the house. And that I had to make the tough decision to ask her to stay somewhere else. They'd nod, sympathizing, saying things like, "You did what you had to do," and "There's no way you could have handled 5 kids in one house for much longer." But underneath the surface, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if I had done what I had to do. Or if I had simply done what I felt I had no other choice but to do in the moment. The lines between right and wrong had blurred. My sister texted me every now and then. Brief updates about how the kids were doing. Or the occasional check-in to see how I was holding up. But we hadn't really talked. Not like we used to. Before the storm, we had been close, maybe not best friends. But close enough that we could confide in each other about life's struggles without hesitation. Now, our conversations were surface level. Stilted. I wondered if she still resented me. If she still harbored anger for the way things had unfolded. Or if she, too, was grappling with the aftermath. Unsure of how to make things right. One night, after the kids were in bed and the house was quiet, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the stars blink into the night sky. The air was cool, crisp, the kind of evening that makes everything feel just a little bit clearer. And in that moment of stillness, the thoughts I had been pushing aside for weeks came rushing back to the forefront of my mind. Had I been too harsh? Too rigid? Could I have found a better way to handle things? Instead of letting my frustration boil over in that explosive argument? The guilt that had been simmering since she left began to rise again. And I felt myself sinking into it. My sister had lost everything, her home, her sense of security, the life she had worked so hard to build. She had come to me for help. And instead of being the support she needed, I had pushed her away when things got hard. Yes, she had been careless with the locks. Yes, her kids had created chaos in my home. But wasn't that what families were supposed to do for each other? Step up when things got messy. Even when it was inconvenient. I had wanted to be that person for her. But I had failed. I had let my need for control, for structure, take precedence over my compassion. I tried to reason with myself. To justify my actions. I reminded myself that I was a mom, too, and that my kids' safety had to come first. I told myself that I had every right to set boundaries in my own home. That it wasn't wrong to expect her to follow the rules. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let her down. The next morning, I called my mom. I hadn't talked to her much about what had happened with my sister. Mostly because I didn't want to hear her say that I had been too harsh. But I needed to talk to someone who knew both of us. Someone who might be able to give me perspective. As soon as I heard her voice on the other end of the line, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I told her everything. How things had gone with my sister. How the tension had built up. How I had finally asked her to leave. And then I told her how I felt now. The guilt that wouldn't go away. The feeling that maybe I had handled it all wrong. My mom listened quietly, not interrupting, just letting me get it all out. When I finished, there was a long pause. And for a moment, I thought she was going to say exactly what I feared, that I should have been more patient. More understanding. But instead, she sighed softly. I think you did the best you could in a difficult situation. She said, it's hard when family is involved. You want to help, but sometimes it feels like there's no good way to do it. You have your own family to think about. And your own peace of mind. You're allowed to set boundaries. Even with the people you love. I felt a lump rise in my throat. But what if I pushed her away when she needed me the most? You didn't push her away. My mom said gently. You gave her a place to stay when she had nowhere else to go. And you did that for weeks. Even when it was hard for you. That's not nothing. You didn't turn your back on her. I let her words sink in. Feeling the guilt start to loosen its grip on me. Even if only a little. She was right. I hadn't abandoned my sister. I had tried. I had opened my home to her and her family. Even when it had been hard. And maybe it hadn't worked out the way I had hoped. But that didn't mean I hadn't been there for her in the ways that I could. After the call, I sat with my thoughts for a while longer. I still wasn't sure if I had handled things perfectly. I still wondered if I could have done more. If I could have been more patient. More flexible. But I also knew that I had reached my limit. That I had done what I needed to do to protect my own family's sense of stability and safety. Was I the A*hole? I didn't know. Maybe, in some ways, I had been. But I also knew that I had been in an impossible situation. Trying to balance the needs of my sister and her family with my own. And in the end, I had made the best decision I could with the information and resources I had at the time. The door was still open. My sister and I weren't estranged. And I hoped that, in time, we could rebuild the closeness we once had. For now, though, I had to accept that we were both healing in our own ways. Finding our footing in the aftermath of everything that had happened. As I sat in the quiet of my home that night, I finally let myself feel a sense of peace. The guilt was still there. But it wasn't as heavy anymore. I had done what I thought was right. Even if it hadn't been easy. And maybe that was enough.